Hello, lovely friend. I am Dr. Mary Barson.
And I'm Dr. Lucy Burns.
And this is the Real Health and Weight Loss Podcast. Hello, lovely friend. Dr. Mary here. We have just had International World Health Day, and I am joined by my fabulous colleague, Dr. Lucy. Lovely Dr. Lucy, how are you today?
I am awesome. Thank you for asking, Mary. Dr. Mary, So last month, I presented at the newly formed Australasian Metabolic Health Society at their very first course for doctors. So metabolic health is what I would perceive to be, one of the greatest threats to humanity, certainly to our health. And I thought, given we've just had World Health Day, that maybe what we could do is start with, a bit of a definition on health, start also then just, distill a little bit further what metabolic health means and how it affects everybody, and how, the way I look at it, it is robbing people of a third of their life. Like, I like to divide our life into thirds. You've got your first third where you're sort of, you're young, your child, young adolescent, young adult. Then you've got your middle third where you're working, raising your family. And then you've got your final third where often you'll, maybe enter retirement and you sort of reap the rewards of all the work you've sown, and people are being robbed of this. And so I thought this would be a great topic to chat about.
It is, yes. Insulin resistance is quite possibly the epidemic you've never heard of, and it is the epidemic of our time.
Indeed.
Yes. Okay, so what is health? The WHO defines health as a state of complete physical, mental, and social well-being, and not merely the absence of disease or infirmity. I like that one.
Yeah, I like that one. I like that. I think it's interesting. I think we need to be mindful that the word health, or healthy in particular, has been weaponised in many of, discussions that go on in social media to sort of have a moral tone to it. People go, they're not very healthy, and it's this sort of, judgment, all that food's not healthy, even to the point of scientific literature where they will talk about healthy fats, for example, as though the word healthy is an objective term. So I think healthy, that's a subjective term that people use to describe, something, much in the same way that the word pretty or beautiful, it's there, but it's highly subjective. And so, heart healthy grains, for example, doing something that is healthy, it's all sort of, you can almost substitute it for good, holy, moral. So I want to be very clear that and look, and because it's part of, common parlance, we will still use that word. But at the end of the day, health is the definition that you've described, I think, Maz.
Yes. And leading question alert, what do you think is one of the main factors out there that is robbing us of our health? Why are we not as healthy, to use that subjective term, as we want to be, particularly in our later years in life?
Well, having just presented at the Australasian Metabolic Health Society, the root cause of poor metabolic health, and we'll talk about what metabolic health even means, is insulin resistance. So insulin resistance and hyperinsulinemia, which is just our very fancy way of saying high blood insulin, are slightly different terms, but used interchangeably often, and at the end of the day have very much a similar result on the health of the body or the health of the human's body and mind. So we will use them intermittently. We will talk about high circulating insulin. We'll talk about insulin resistance. And when we're feeling very fancy, we'll talk about hyperinsulinemia. But at the end of the day, they all result in the same process. And that process is that it becomes harmful to our body and causes, chronic disease that is manifesting often for a long time before we're aware of it.
That is a key point. Most people with insulin resistance don't know that they have it. It's a silent killer in that regard, and it's often not discovered until quite late in the disease process, which I think is a travesty, because there is so much that you can do to stop it in its tracks, to reverse it. There's a lot you can do by making those healthy interventions for yourself in a way that improves your health. You can do it, but before insulin resistance and high blood insulin wreaks irreversible damage to your health.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's some signs that people can have that they may not even be aware of, that are, they're not diagnostic, but they're like a little warning sign. Oh, maybe I've got insulin resistance. So, I think people always go, well, how do I know? And ultimately the only way to really know is through blood testing. Like, we don't have home blood testing like you can do with glucose. It has to be a blood test that you have at a pathology lab. And we can do a fasting level, i.e. what's your insulin levels when you're not eating anything, or we can get a little bit fancy and do one that's like a glucose tolerance test, where you have a glucose drink and you measure both usually the insulin and the glucose at the 1 hour and the 2 hour mark. Or sometimes we can create a formula, use something that's called the HOMA IR, and it's just a mathematical formula where we plug some numbers in, and that will give us like a quotient that will tell us, whether you're insulin resistant or not. But the symptoms or the signs, or what could you look for, like what would give you a clue? There's a few, and in particular one that many people have, they don't realise, is skin tags. So people that have skin tags on their neck or under their arms, in their groin, maybe, under your boobs if you're a female. And again, lots of people have one here and there, and that's normal. But if you find you've got lots, it's a bit of a clue. So we see that. And the other clue is if you store your body fat round your middle rather than round your bottom and legs, especially if you're female. So if you're an apple, not a pear, then you're more likely to be insulin resistant. And if for some people they can get some pigmentation on their skin, and this might be, again, underarms, groin, but it can be on your forehead or side of your neck or forearms, and you get this sort of brownish sort of velvety pigmentation. And at first you might think it's sort of dirt and you try and rub it off, but it doesn't go. And again, that's something called acanthosis nigricans, and it is often associated with high circulating insulin. So there are a couple of just signs that before you've even seen the doctor as to what might be going on. But Mez, maybe you could talk a little bit more about why we care so much about high insulin. Like, why is it a big deal?
Yeah. I think it could be useful to take one little step back and to say, what is insulin? Most people are going to be familiar with the word, but they may associate it with as a drug treatment for diabetes, for example.
Yes.
But insulin it's a hormone that we make. So it's a protein that our body makes. In this case, it's made by our pancreas, which is a little gland sort of tucked away behind our stomach. And our pancreas makes this hormone and releases it into the blood. It circulates around our blood, and it has a vital role to play in how many vital roles, but its most important role is it dictates how every single cell in our body, you know, from our brain right down to the tip of our toes, how every single cell in our body uses fuel. But it also dictates the size of the cell, how the cell behaves, how big the cell gets, lots of other factors as well. And most people will be familiar with insulin's role in taking the sugar out of our blood. So after we eat a meal that contains either sugar or starch, that those carbohydrates are broken down into their sugar components, they're released into our bloodstream. High blood sugar is extremely dangerous, even life-threatening if it gets too high. And our body releases insulin in response to this. And then our body can then take that sugar and can allow cells to take it up. So they can either burn it for fuel, or fat cells can then store it as fat. Our liver can store it as glycogen or as fat. Our muscle cells store it as glycogen, and allows us to essentially use that fuel. And insulin has, like every single cell in our body, has got insulin receptors, and pretty much every single cell in our body, and every single organ system in our body responds to insulin in different ways. And it's great when it's functioning normally. In fact, you would be dead without insulin. But the problem is that for many of us, insulin has started to function abnormally, and our body is becoming intolerant to the amount of sugars and starches in our diet, and our body then has to respond by making more insulin to deal with the sugars and starches. And we get into this state of insulin resistance, which is a complex metabolic disorder, which we can unpick a little bit. And in response to the insulin resistance, our body has to make more insulin. So it's that combination of high circulating insulin and insulin resistance, which is so problematic. But then that high circulating insulin plays a significant role in a devastating number of hideous chronic illnesses, including type 2 diabetes, heart disease, neurodegenerative disorders like Alzheimer's disease, disorders of our reproductive system, such as polycystic ovarian syndrome, and even many cancers. So it's not a benign situation at all.
No. I heard a way to try and explain a little bit of insulin resistance, which was this idea that insulin is, as you mentioned, every cell has receptors, and it's a bit like a loudspeaker, and it signals a transporter. So the transporter is called GLUT4, and it signals this transporter to take the glucose or the sugar from the blood and sort of carry it into the cell. So the problem comes when the transporter, when it's a bit like it can't hear it anymore. So it's a bit like when you're watching telly and there's background noise, so you turn the telly up and so that you can hear it. So the concept is still the same. So we need more insulin to do the same job. Basically we turn the telly up, we get more insulin, more loudspeakers. The pancreas, so kind, makes more insulin for us in order to do that same job of transporting the glucose into the cells. And as you mentioned, up until recently, and look, honestly, when I was a junior doctor, we knew nothing of this. So this is not old science. We knew nothing about this. And the syndrome, that it was called Syndrome X, which sounds so kind of sci-fi, because we didn't know what was going on. We had no concept. And so over time, it became clearer that, high circulating insulin was at the root cause of Syndrome X, which then, became renamed metabolic syndrome. And metabolic syndrome has its, there's a number of conditions that cluster together, all with the same root cause. But in particular, high blood pressure, dyslipidemia, it's called, which is just a fancy name for low HDL and high triglycerides usually, fatty liver and fatty liver disease. And you don't even need to have all of them to have metabolic syndrome. And in fact, apart from hypertension, I mean, fatty liver disease, it's now been renamed metabolic fatty liver disease, metabolic associated fatty liver disease. So we do know they're all the same thing. They're all the same thing.
And so incredibly common and widespread, and a driver behind so many of these illnesses that are robbing us of our health.
Yeah, absolutely. To the point where sometimes it's become so normalized. So, we've had situations where fatty liver is no longer reported on ultrasound because it's so normal. It's sort of considered, it's just a normal variant, except that it's not. And the same, with triglycerides. Like I remember as a doctor, before I became a lifestyle medicine doctor, again, I was back in the old days of prescribing statins for everyone with high cholesterol. And even when they had high triglycerides in it, they didn't do anything. I still prescribed them because I had no idea what to do.
And it could even be, there is still a reluctance out there in some pockets of the medical community to measure insulin and to test for insulin resistance, because there is perhaps still an idea that, well, okay, we'll do it, but then what can you do about it? There's nothing that you can do. It's just a chronic onward progression towards type 2 diabetes. So what's the point? But of course, there are things you can do if you have insulin resistance. And I reckon it's also important to pick apart here the difference in blood glucose, measuring blood glucose and measuring blood insulin, because historically we've placed a lot of emphasis on measuring blood sugar and and diagnosing type 2 diabetes on the basis of people's blood sugar, either their fasting blood sugar or their HbA1c, which is looking at their blood sugar control over the last 3 months. And the genesis of this, so if you could imagine that type 2 diabetes is a really significant insulin resistance. It's almost like when insulin resistance has become so significant that the body is no longer able to actually control blood sugar. But for decades before then, our body's compensating. So we're not tolerating the quantity of sugars and starches that we're eating, and our body is making more insulin, and the cells aren't coping with it all, so they're hiding their GLUT4 receptors. So then our pancreas starts screaming at our cells, making even more insulin, and so you have to take this sugar. You just have to. And then the cells are unhappy. They're not liking it. Those insulin resistance increases. They try and hide their GLUT4 receptors even more, and then they scream even louder. And then over years, the insulin creeps up and up and up and up, but the body is compensating. It is managing to deal with this sugar. It's managing to deal with the carbohydrates. It's coping until it can't cope anymore. And This is when things have really started to progress. And that is the point in time when blood sugar becomes elevated. And that is the point in time when type 2 diabetes is diagnosed. But before then, decades before then, there is this whole opportunity to intervene before we get there.
Absolutely. And I think this is the missing piece in a lot of people's knowledge, the recognition that insulin and glucose are completely different things. So glucose is a fuel. We either eat it or cleverly we can make it. And insulin is the hormone that comes in response to that glucose level. So they are hand in hand, but they're not the same thing. And I think for a long time we thought that glucose was the problem, and it is, but that in insulin, it was just sort of an innocent bystander trying to do its job. But in fact, we now know that insulin itself, high circulating insulin, is an independent source of pathology. So when you get the double whammy of high glucose and you've had high insulin, it's no wonder our poor old body has trouble.
What causes insulin resistance? It's complex, absolutely. But
It is.
let's, broad brushstrokes. Why are people becoming insulin resistant with high circulating insulin?
Yeah. So broadly, there's it's like lots of our chronic diseases. It's multifactorial, but the two factors come down to genetics and lifestyle. So we all know, we've all seen people who have, what would probably be considered terrible lifestyle choices, but manage to get away with them. But for most people, that doesn't happen. So you'll have genetics that are involved there. And the tricky thing with genetics, because people go, oh, it can't be genetics. I mean, we've been evolving for, thousands of years. How come all of a sudden it's genetics? And that's because of epigenetics. And we've always had these genes, but their genes, the expression of those genes is changing. And again, that's multifactorial. Things like, a baby, a fetus's exposure to glucose levels in the uterus or the womb will increase the baby's chance of being insulin resistant. There's lots of talk currently around plastics and environmental toxins and endocrine interrupters, all of which I have a modicum of knowledge, but I'm no means an expert. So we've got those sort of things going on, but the biggest change that has happened is our food environment. And it is the number one thing that we see, the introduction of that processed food, the processed starches into societies, and within not very long, like a decade, they'll go from being, a population that as a whole is reasonably healthy to a population as a whole that is dealing with metabolic syndrome and type 2 diabetes. And, we see this in Australia, in our Indigenous community. You see it in China, where processed food's been introduced, much more recently, and India, and populations are suffering.
I think it could be useful to talk about the ways in which high circulating insulin affects our health and is increasing this pattern of ill health that we're seeing. And it does it in myriad ways. And I think I really, you could sort of lump it into various organs, brain, heart, reproductive system. You go through every organ, in fact, but I think that we should probably limit it to sort of deepen the understanding of how this is really, really serious, and it needs to be taken extremely serious. This is why we get sick, and why we actually don't have to, or if we are already sick, what we can do to improve our health in simple and safe ways, powerful and safe ways. So, I've got polycystic ovarian syndrome. So we could start there, if you like. That elevated, every insulin affects every single cell and organ in our body, and our ovaries, if you're a woman, respond to insulin just like all of the other organs. And when this is normal insulin signaling, it's all well and good. But insulin resistance in the ovaries and elevated insulin inhibits our ovaries' ability to turn androgens of the male sex hormones into estrogens, the female sex hormones. It inhibits the aromatase activities, the enzymes that do this. So it can result in increased male sex hormones, so the androgen levels. All women are supposed to have some, definitely, but having them in the wrong balance and at the wrong time can affect fertility, and it can also cause symptoms like acne and unwanted hair growth, which can be really distressing. Insulin also directly affects our luteinizing hormone secretion, which is one of the orchestrator hormones of our reproductive health. So it can really affect women's reproductive health, and polycystic ovarian syndrome's really common and really devastating, and is at its heart due to insulin resistance. But it's not just your ovaries, it's your brain as well. that insulin resistance has been associated with decreased fuel utilization in our brain, which can cause all kinds of problems. It's been associated with the laying down of the beta amyloid plaque in Alzheimer's disease. And some people even refer to Alzheimer's disease as like type 3 diabetes. It's the effect of insulin resistance in the brain. Research still ongoing, but there is very compelling evidence that it does this. And your heart as well. Insulin resistance elevates blood sugar, as we were talking about before. It increases our aldosterone hormones, which makes us hang on to more salt and hang on to more fluid, which means we retain more fluid, which increases our blood pressure. And also insulin resistance and high circulating insulin increases our inflammation throughout our whole body. And it's really interesting how this happens, because in the right normal balanced amounts, insulin's actually anti-inflammatory, but too much insulin is pro-inflammatory. And it is the inflammation combined with high blood sugar, combined with the way that insulin affects fats in our blood, that dyslipidemia that you were talking about earlier, that drives atherosclerosis and heart disease, which, as we know, is a really, really serious issue. So it has its finger in all of these pies. It is really a very significant issue, if I haven't already hammered that point home.
Absolutely. And, even further, so there is a new phrase that is now coined called CKM, which is cardio-kidney metabolic dysfunction, so CKMD. Because insulin, so we know glucose is not good for kidneys. We know this. We know that the leading cause of dialysis and chronic renal failure is type 2 diabetes, and we see this devastating communities. But actually what happens is that when people are diagnosed, they've often already got kidney disease, and we used to think that we just diagnosed them too late, i.e., they'd had type 2 diabetes for ages and we didn't know. Actually, now what we're realizing is that it's the insulin. The insulin itself, the high insulin, is damaging to what's called the podocytes, which I love that little word, podocytes, which means little feet, the little feet cells that are part of the filter of the kidney. So the filter of the kidney, which is it's kidney's whole job, is being compromised way, 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 way before blood glucose levels are being elevated. And we also know
it's kind of frightening.
It is because people are relying, I think, on blood glucose. And, if your hemoglobin A1C, which is your measure of blood glucose over 3 months, if that's okay, then, you're okay, except maybe you're not. And I don't mean to say this to be alarmist, but I think it's helpful because you can do something. So it's not like, oh, I'm just going to frighten you and bad luck, you can't do anything. It's actually, you can do something about this. And the other interesting thing that I never realized is that insulin-like growth factor that causes cells to grow that you were mentioning. So that is also our blood vessels. Our blood vessels have tiny little muscle cells in them called smooth muscle, and that grows. And so it becomes, instead of like a nice flexible vessel, becomes like a stiff old hose, which is part of the whole blood pressure thing that then, again, flow on effect to the kidneys, flow on effect to the eyes, flow on effect to the brain, flow on effect to the heart. It's just like the damage is so immense. But the benefit of fixing this or optimizing it, balancing it, doing whatever word you want to do is also immense. Like, I think of every single organ that you can, save, nurture, love, look after simply by taking measures to lower your insulin. Like, it's not rocket science.
It's powerful and it's cheap.
It's so
cheap. That's what,
So So I guess that comes
All
to the
right.
next question then of what do people do to lower their insulin?
And improve their insulin sensitivity. So I mean, there are a few things they should do, and they're all pretty cheap. Number one is look at how you are nourishing your body, and it may well be, and in fact it is, if you are someone who's got insulin resistance and high circulating insulin, either a little bit or a lot, that you would benefit from reducing the sugar and reducing the starch that you eat, and definitely reducing the processed food, the hyper-processed food that you eat, and learning to love and embrace real food. That's that real food that's naturally lower in sugar and naturally lower in starches is going to be the most powerful intervention that you can take for your health. Absolutely. It's not the only one, but it is a really important one. No, indeed.
And in some ways, we've distilled it to the 4 S's. So one of the S's being sustenance, because not that it's a word that we use a lot, but it just fits with that S paradigm. So sustenance, which is your food, which as you mentioned, Mary, is very much low, for us, lower carbohydrate food, nutrition. So that's your sustenance. And that can also incorporate some intermittent fasting, as we discussed in our most recent episode last week. So that's kind of your S. Strength is your next S. So we know that muscle is your metabolic organ. The more muscle you have, the more protected you are. And this is where, I'm so acutely aware of this, having not much muscle. So again, lots of you will know, but if you're a new listener to our podcast, I have muscular dystrophy, which means I don't have a lot of muscle mass. My muscles, they just sort of are fading away. So the ability, therefore, for my body to store its glucose, utilize its glucose is much, much more impaired. And plenty of people with muscle wasting diseases end up with type 2 diabetes, just related to that metabolic function. So the more muscle you can build, the better your metabolism, the more sensitive those muscles become, the less insulin, coming back to the telly, you can turn down the telly by increasing your muscle mass.
Yes. With strength training, a little goes a long way. It does, indeed.
Absolutely.
You don't need to be a bodybuilder, but you do need to move around and lift some heavy things, and heavy things can be your own body weight. That's pretty heavy.
Yeah. So we've got sustenance, we've got strength. What's next, Maz?
Sleep. Sleep is so important. Being in a sleep-deprived state, and that is another chronic epidemic of our time, increases our insulin resistance to a significant degree. And so ensuring that you get good quality sleep, that you prioritize your sleep, and that you take measures to ensure that your sleep is as good as it can be. Give yourself a non-negotiable 8-hour window, limit your caffeine later in the day, look at your alcohol. All of these things will help your sleep. And if you've got good sleep, then you're going to improve your insulin sensitivity. Sleep is vital.
Absolutely. So we've got sustenance, we've got strength, we've got sleep, and our final S, which we talk about quite a lot on this podcast, is stress. So again, recognizing that stress is inevitable. Nobody lives in a stress-free existence, and that's not what we're aiming for. What we need to do is to develop the skills to manage that stress so that we can look after ourselves when times are tougher, when things are a bit rocky. It's just a skill problem, that's all. And when you've learned really good stress management techniques, you get better, your metabolism improves, and you actually become, it's like a flow on. So the better you are at managing your stress, the better you become at managing your stress, which is kind of funny.
Spiral upwards.
Yeah,
that's
spiral
right.
upwards.
That's it. And you want to do it because that's right. Stress increases our insulin resistance, and managing it increases our insulin sensitivity. And yeah, look, again, I'd say a little bit goes a long way.
Yeah.
You don't need to completely transform every aspect of your health and leave your job and go live on a tropical island. Small steps that you can fit into your daily life are going to dramatically improve your insulin resistance, decrease your insulin sensitivity, and can turn your whole health around.
Absolutely. And therefore, on this World Health Week, you too can become, basically a being that is thriving. And when you're thriving, you become what we love to call a hottie, healthy on the inside. That will most definitely be reflected on the outside. But we all want to strive to be fabulous hotties, healthy on the inside.
That's right. You're a hottie, Lucy. I'm a hottie, and we want everybody in the world to be a hottie too.
Absolutely. All right, hotties. We'll see you all next week. Bye for now.
Bye, gorgeous ones.
The information shared on the Real Health and Weight Loss podcast, including show notes and links, provides general information only. It is not a substitute, nor is it intended to provide individualised medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment, nor can it be construed as such. Please consult your doctor for any medical concerns.